I mean, I'll say I thought it was pretty significant that Judge Alsup wanted to understand the science before ruling on the merits of whether the case should go forward. And so I would have liked it better if it was, if scientists were required to present that information rather than lawyers, as much as I love us. But I think it was somewhat groundbreaking. Now, Judge Alsup has done this in other contexts, and so it's a credit to him as a jurist to really want to understand the issues before he makes rulings. The fact that we disagree with his decision doesn't make him, he is still an excellent judge who was thoughtful. We just came to a different conclusion. But I think it was significant that he wanted to understand the science. And I don't disagree that I think this is like one permutation route. Now it's oh yes, global warming exists, but it's not just us, it's everyone. It's an international problem. Court, don't deal with it, right? So that's kind of the next legal argument that they're putting forth, and that certainly was successful in, at least in these beginning stages in front of Judge Alsup. But I thought it was significant that he mandated that they come and that they present a case for the science so early on in a case. That is somewhat unusual. But.
So given that, yeah, the oil industry is very sophisticated at sort of the kind of dodge and pivot or the dodge and weave and saying, now they've said, yes, it's happening and yes, humans are driving it, but it's not our fault because you all bought it and you're putting it in your cars. Right. So I'm wondering, I'd love to hear from Christina or Mayor, any of you, what you think is sort of the best response to that, because I do think that's sort of the space we're at now, and as I kind of said in the introduction, you look at that Nathaniel Rich essay or kind of investigative essay, that is to some people a potent or at least a compelling argument. So what would be your response to that? That's, you know, oh, this would have happened anyway, and you all asked for it.
I think that's a great question, and I think I'll approach it from a personal point of view. So I've worked at the Union of Concerned Scientists as a contractor for many years and just started full-time with them earlier this year. And I think it was about a year ago that I was first asked to get involved in what we call our accountability work, so holding the fossil fuel companies accountable. And that's not usually my area of research, and so I started stepping into it with a lot of caution. You know, I'm not like someone who's crazy about my car or anything. I drive an old beater, but I drive, right? And, you know, we like to drive to Yosemite and we like to do this. And we are all users of cars. We all heat our homes. You know, we do all use fossil fuels. And so I came to this with a fair amount of reluctance because I was not yet convinced that this was the right approach, right? But then you start looking at stuff like that, right? And you start hearing from people like Stephen, who have documented what the oil companies knew and when they knew it. And look at how much we have damaged our Earth in the last 30 years with that knowledge, right? And so I can't quite remember exactly what your question was, but I guess
how do you respond to the carbon polluters,
right?
Sort of their current dodge and pivot, which is yes, it's happening, but no, we're not responsible.
Right. So you knew where this would get us in the 1980s, and yet you denied it. You provided misinformation for decades, and you've sowed this incredibly toxic political discourse about the issue that's prevented action from Congress. And so I feel like in the past year, I've come to a point where the pieces have all started to fall into place. And I think that with this weight of evidence, there's no way we can say that these companies should not be held to pay.
Can I just jump in for a second?
Yeah,
I also think that, you know, speaking as a public lawyer, government is only as good as the information that it has, right? And so when you have a campaign of misinformation, you deprive your city councils, your state legislatures, Congress of the ability to take information and act on it and make policy decisions based on that. And so to the extent that there was for decades misinformation and inaccurate information and denials of what scientists were advocating from the rafters, I wonder, this is just me, Yvonne, wondering whether or not if we had embraced science 3 decades ago, whether or not we might have made different policy decisions as government that would have us in a different space right now.
Yeah, I'd love to hear your answer to the question. I also want to toss out, just also to throw in the conversation, last night there was a great 350 event in the city affiliated with the Global Climate Action Summit, and there was a young woman, I believe a 16-year-old, who got up and talked about the divestment movement or the divestment work she's been doing and pointed out that she never had a choice. She's 16 years old. Or you could say a 30-year-old born in 1988 never had a choice either, and how that maybe influences some of the work at 350 that I think is still very, in many ways, kind of youth-led and youth-centered.
Yeah, I think that idea that there has not been a choice is incredibly powerful and motivating in responding to that point that you're raising. And I think there's a few other points. One is the transition off of their product is already underway. And I think we've spoken a little bit less about that today, but the clean energy economy is doing far better than a lot of the fossil fuel companies would like and would have predicted. And it's doing better than most clean energy forecasters predicted. And so I think there is something very powerful in changing the conversation and actually saying this is inevitable. It's a question of how quickly and how fairly this happens. And so most of the time we do like to talk about dismantling the social license of the fossil fuel industry, but I think there's incredible power in delegitimizing their product and their need to exist. And I think the other part that's important here is this is not happening in a vacuum in this country and in many other countries where corporations have so much more power now than they did even 10 years ago, let alone 50 years ago when a lot of this science was being revealed. And so we're having a debate that has so weakened government's ability to act because of the influence of the lobbying money, because of the influence of corporate power. And so it's just warped a conversation that should be about public policy making in any rational way. Like, I got involved in the climate movement because I studied political science in school. And you study political science in a way that is completely unhelpful to today's context. I wrote my thesis about the role of corporate lobbying, and I had a professor say, well, that's not really in the literature, so how are you going to write about that? So even in my short lifetime, their power has gotten even bigger, and the fossil fuel companies are one of the best examples we have of this trend and how it has warped a public dialogue. So I think that has to be part of this discussion about how the corporations frame this debate for us, and we're stuck responding to them. And I guess a better way of making my earlier point is when we talk about 100% renewable energy and we talk about the just transition, we are framing the debate ourselves. Our movement is framing it, and they have to respond to us.
So one last question for all of you before we open up to audience questions. We actually, May and I have cooked up an audience engagement thing so you all can talk to each other for a minute. But I would love you all to throw out some of your best ideas or even half-baked ideas on how how non-lawyers can get involved in this, because I think it's easy at the divestment movement. It's like, go to your own bank account, your 401k, pull it out of fossil fuels, keep it in the ground, come to an anti-Keystone XL, anti-Dakota Access Pipeline protest. What can folks do who aren't working in the city attorney's office do to get engaged in this legal accountability work, this climate accountability work?
I mean, I'll limit my answer to this kind of work because I have lots of half-baked thoughts about lots of things. But I think it is it can be intimidating for people to really take ownership of the fact that their government is supposed to work for them and serve them. And I think just getting in touch with your local officials, whatever version of that is. I mean, I live in DC, so that's its own specific kind of thing. But whether you're in a city, incorporated village, or it's the state level, wherever you can talk to the people making policy, whether that's climate policy or whether it's the authority to bring or instigate litigation. Just making a phone call or writing an email and understanding if they're thinking about it or what they're thinking, if they are thinking any about it, is probably a good way to start. I mean, that's my raw potato idea.
That was pretty baked. Christina or Yvonne?
I would agree with that. I would also say that, you know, most cities have legal departments that defend the city when it's sued because someone is injured in a public space or there is an allegation that a city worker acted inappropriately. A smaller number of cities actually act affirmatively on behalf of their cities by filing cases like this. And so in addition to reaching out to the policymakers that legislate, I would also challenge your city attorneys, whether they are elected city attorneys or appointed city attorneys, to take stances on behalf of your city, to make your city as a municipal entity heard, especially on issues like this, public nuisance issues, climate change issues. There is a power in local government. We don't think of government as pushing the envelope like the advocates, but you can, and you can, often it's just either the will of the city attorney involved or the will of her constituents that can push someone into trying a new tactic.
Can I ask you kind of a follow-up question on that? It's sort of an embedded assumption in your guys' point there that how important is strength in numbers? Like how important is it to get additional jurisdictions, cities, counties, perhaps more states like Rhode Island to file similar suits? This is sort of like a legal theory of change.
I think it's really important. I think if you look at some of the major social changes, sometimes there are a series of lawsuits that have to happen to change, and public opinion starts to change with that. You saw that in marriage, right? You saw, if you look at civil marriage litigation in California from 2004 until the present, you saw that there were a series of cases that were filed. My office filed 3 of them, and public opinion was changing with that litigation. We didn't do it alone. We were late to the party. Lots of people were fighting for marriage for all much before we started. But it was interesting to watch how public opinion kind of fueled the legal theories and got the courts ready to accept a major social change. So I think it's really important.
So May, Christina, some other ideas on how folks can and should get involved?
Well, there's a couple people in this room who are helping organize elected officials all over the country to take on fights like this. If you guys could wave your hands. So if you want to learn more about what they're doing, there's a lot of work to help people who are already putting a lot of these strategies in action to learn from each other and to build the impact of the movement. So that's very helpful. And I would never underestimate the role of communications. You know, some people living in San Francisco probably don't know about California's suit, I would venture to guess. And I think some people would want San Francisco to do more about climate change, and that Venn diagram could connect if more of us were talking about this. So part of our role as activists is to spread the word about good stories and good news that is out there. So helping to get the word out in whatever ways you can, that this is part of the climate fight, it's part of the struggle, and San Francisco is one of many cities worldwide that's doing this, is a really important thing you could all do.